about India in space, policy, innovation, and strategy. And so I always like to start with this particular quote by the founder of India's space program, Vikram Sarabhai. And so Sarabhai had said that there are some who questions the relevance of space activities in a developing nation. And this was in the 1960s when he said this. To us, there is no ambiguity of purpose. We do not have the fantasy of competing with the economically advanced nations in the exploration of the moon or the planet or manned spaceflight. But we are convinced that if we are to play a meaningful role nationally and in the community of nations, we must be second to none in the application of advanced technologies to the real problems of man and society. And so this is the philosophical ethos of India's space program. And even today, when India, as you know, has missions to the moon and Mars, this still remains the key founding guideline of that particular program. So if you look at India's space program, it started in 1969 officially with the launch of the Indian Space Research Organization. And India sent the first satellite on a Soviet rocket in 1975 called the Aryabhata, which is named after an ancient Indian mathematician. We talked about math in the presentation before. And so, as you know, India is credited in discovering the zero, at least in the Indian philosophical imagination. And so India's start was very humble. If you look at some of the pictures, the rockets were actually transported on a bicycle at times. So from there to today, it has been an amazing journey for this nation that ended colonial rule in 1947. And so as of date, India has launched about 82 launches to include 112 spacecrafts and 2 re-entry missions. So what are the key drivers of India's space program and space policy? One thing that is really critical to understand when you think about space policy and space innovation is that a sense of nationhood and nationalism still plays a role. You see that in the US space program, you see that in the Chinese space program, and you see that in the Indian space program. But more importantly, space program in India has been a lot about nation building. So you build the nation in terms of lifting millions of people out of poverty by using technology. And one technology, as Vikram Sarabhai so aptly understood, was space technology. So space technology for India is critical. India is by and large an agricultural nation, so weather forecasting, where crops can be yielded, and today in terms of technology for a digital economy that India is hoping to build. Now, space is also utilized for regime legitimacy for a particular government in power. So if you do achievements in space, it's seen as something that builds into the legitimacy of that particular party. I already spoke about internal national development, but space is also critical from the Indian perspective in terms of external status. So foreign policy, diplomatic move, space plays a very critical role. And India takes its role at the level of the United Nations very seriously, including in terms of building governance structures as to how space will be constituted. Entrepreneurship. So this is something which is very, very interesting. In the last few years, India has taken this decision to commercialize its space industry. This is an extremely unique decision for India that has been very state-funded in its space program. So the Indian space policy, I'll talk about that in a bit, which was instituted this year, actually tells you that India is going to completely commercialize its space manufacturing, launch, as well as the development of satellite capability in the next few years. And the motive for India is that as a country that wants to contribute a very large amount of money to the 400 billion space industry that exists today. And so that's a very critical driver for India's space program. And then finally, national security plays a role too. So India, as you know, is a nuclear weapon state. And so nuclear command and control, military command and control, GPS, navigation, timing, all these plays into the Indian conceptualization of space as well. So what are some of India's space capacity? Why are we talking about India at all in this forum? So India did hold the record of launching the highest number of satellites till 2017. Today, of course, it's SpaceX that launched the highest number. One of the biggest contribution, I think, of India to the world, and which is really unique, is the low cost of its space missions. So we talk a lot about space becoming democratic, space building more access to humanity, building better and better science and understanding. It still demands a lot of money and a lot of taxpayer money. And so the Indian missions are actually very cost effective. For example, its Mars mission cost about $74 million. The Chandrayaan-3 mission that is actually taking the world by a lot of interest in India cost about $75 million from the launch system to the building of the capability to land near the south pole of the moon. And that's a unique contribution that India makes, and which is making it an interesting partner of choice for other nations. India does have its own launch capability. It's got the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, the Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle, which is able to take about 4 tons to geo and 10 tons to low Earth orbit. Now, India is also focused on, as you know, lunar missions, reusability. Now, this is again key. So if you think about space programs and space policy, we talked a lot about access today, and this is a UN Science Summit. I think without having low-cost access to space, space still remains a very elite enterprise, in my perspective, despite the fact that space is contributing to all the benefits I talked about, navigation, GPS, and communication. But I would still say that the fact that only about 600 of us have been to space and today a seat costs about millions of dollars means a country like India focusing on reusable rockets, building the entire system in a reusable manner is going to bring down that cost, which means the ability of humans to get to space is going to get much more capable in the next few years. Now, these are some of India's missions that I will talk about quickly. So we know about the Chandrayaan program. So the Chandrayaan is, of course, India's lunar mission that started in 2008, confirmed the presence of water ice. The Chandrayaan-2 mission was a mission that aimed and attempted to land on the lunar south pole, but failed in the last few seconds. And then just this year, India, of course, landed successfully on the near the lunar south pole. Now, India also has sent a very interesting mission called the Aditya-1 mission. That's the mission that is going to study the sun. And what is interesting is that India wants to locate its Aditya-1 experiment at the Sun-Earth Lagrange point 1. The idea is that you're able to observe the sun directly there and to understand the differences in temperature, for example, corona. But more importantly, it's very fascinating. So that particular mission also has another goal, which is that will it be able to tell us on Earth about solar flares? So it takes about 18 hours for a solar flare to reach Earth. So will the Aditya-1 mission give us advance warning that that kind of a flare is happening so that we can do something about the satellites that might get fried, or we do not suffer from an event that happened in 1859 called the Carrington event, where telegraph lines were actually destroyed. So that's a contribution that India hopes to do for global good, which is a very interesting mission in my mind. So I wanted to show you a little about the I hope this works, the video of the Chandrayaan-3 mission. Sorry? It does, but it doesn't matter if the audio, I just wanted to play the video. It's not loading. So anyway, this particular video was about how much the Chandrayaan-3 mission also caught the imagination of Indians. So the kind of celebration, the kind of media interest, but not just that. What was interesting to me was that a whole lot of younger generation were inspired by that mission, not because India landed for the first time close to the South Pole, but because it involved a lot of women. It involved a lot of young people in the design of the mission, as well as the way the mission was conceptualized. The other thing which I find very interesting in terms of India's space program is that even I have been critical about this particular aspect of India's space program, which is that India had not been very transparent in terms of the data that they would generate or the space program that they had. But what was so insightful for me in terms of the Chandrayaan-3 mission was that they were very open about the data that they were finding, including the rover, the fact that they confirmed the presence of sulfur near the lunar south pole, the other elements that they detected. They put it out on X, which is again a very interesting and very good development for a democratic nation. And that's something I think we need in space. We need more transparency. Also, we need more global data sharing, which this particular program showcased. So if you look at India's civilian space policy, fast forward from Chandrayaan-3, one thing which I already mentioned was that India has a reputation as a reliable and cost-effective launch provider. India's 2023 space policy is, again, a very critical departure for two reasons. One, of course, is the fact that India is planning to commercialize its entire space industry. But second, and this is something where the conversation today is, in terms of where space is going. And this is where I think the departure point is. And I don't think this has been grasped enough in the literature. It's still a lot about space exploration, space science, space development. That's all good. But if you look at the Indian space policy statements, one of the interesting point of the policy was that if Indian citizens or non-governmental entities discover resources on an asteroid, they can keep it, and they own it, and they can profit from it. Now, this is a very interesting development from India, who had been very reticent in terms of such policy. Another Asian country which has a very similar perspective on space resources is, of course, Japan, and now you have India. China is also thinking in terms of coming up with a very similar space law. This tells you that concepts like asteroid mining, lunar resources, the fact that the Indian Chandrayaan-3 mission is a lot about confirming elements, as they call it, like aluminum, titanium, iron ore on the lunar surface, that's the mission goal, tells you that the entire focus of India's lunar mission is also changing. It's not just about demonstration of capability and showing you that they can soft land, but actually what are the contributions in terms of long-term human habitation? What are the possibilities of lunar resource extraction? And what could be the legal mechanisms that India can contribute, including through the institution of their space law? So what are some of India's future missions that we need to keep in mind when we think about India's space policy, innovation, and contribution? One, of course, as I mentioned, is the Chandrayaan-3 continuation. So in 2026, India wants to collaborate with Japan to go back to the moon, this time to study the lunar south pole in much more detail and to carry out one of the most important contributions to science and space, I think, that will probably revolutionize the way we think about space, the presence of water ice on the lunar south pole. That's the only focus of those two missions. And they want to do it by 2026. India also wants to send a second Mars orbiter by 2025. And this time, they want to study the Martian atmosphere from a much more detailed perspective. So these are some of the future missions that we need to think about when we think about India. But also what I find fascinating is that India's discourse in terms of space policy, space innovation, and space technology is changing and is also being picked up by other nations. So in the last few months, I have done a lot of interactions with global media and students across the world. And one of the questions I keep getting is that how can the Indian model be utilized to actually build space capability and technology so that it benefits? The comparison is always made, of course, with the US space program, which many countries see as very expensive. And so how can another country offer a much more cost-effective capability to get to space, which other countries can then emulate, especially the emerging nations? India also has a human spaceflight program called the Gaganyaan mission, and this is basically the idea to send another 3 members of India's astronaut community to low Earth orbit. India just signed, as you know, agreement with the United States, and in fact with NASA, to create a strategic human spaceflight program by 2023 and to send Indian astronauts to the International Space Station by 2024. Again, strategically very critical, because 2024 is a time where Russia has made statements that they might start exiting the International Space Station. So India is now coming in as a very critical partner for that particular perspective. India also has military space capability, so I cannot speak about India and not speak about the fact that India is investing in military capability, military satellites. India also is one of the 4 nations, including the United States, China, and Russia, to have tested an anti-satellite weapon. The Indian test was conducted in 2019 and created about 400 pieces of space debris. India has also established a defense space agency, very similar to the Space Force, under the Indian Air Force, and then a Defense Space and Development Organization. And what was interesting to me, and again, this is something that when we think about countries and contribution to space, countries frame space in a very interesting manner, and this is sometimes lost to the scientific community. And I think in a science summit, we need to understand that nations also think about space from national security, not always as a global good or a global common. And so if you look at India's conceptualization, while it wants to be a very responsible player in space, including contribution to civilian data and scientific data, the only time that the Prime Minister of India basically tweeted that India has now become a space power is when India tested its anti-satellite weapon. And so the argument was that India now has the capability to showcase its deterrent to nations that might threaten its own satellite capability. So it's very critical to keep that in mind when we think about space and space power. And this is because, and there's a reason for this, and so I think India inhabits a world where it's surrounded by nuclear weapon state. You know, the United States, here we have a very, I would say, a luxurious existence. We do not have Canada as a nuclear weapon state, nor do we have Mexico as a nuclear weapon state. So the US can think about foreign policy postures without having to worry too much about its neighborhood, especially the presence of nuclear weapons. For India, there are 2 nuclear weapon states with which India has disputed territory. One is China, with the largest number of nuclear weapons in Asia, and the second is Pakistan. And so having to live in that context always limits India's capability, and the fact that conflicts escalated at the border meant India took the very critical decision of using satellites to locate their disputed border, including the line of actual control in the higher Himalayas. These are images from Maxar that documented the presence of certain hardened structures that China had built on the Indian side of the line of actual control. That border and the territory is disputed between India and China. So in the few minutes that I have, I will say that I want to leave you with few changing thoughts. So we talked about the start of India's space program, very much about national development, contribution to the citizens of India, my father's generation, how they would benefit. Vikram Sarabhai talked about the fact that space has to be about the Indian common person and build agriculture, weather forecasting. We cannot play the high level of global politics. That changing discourse is interesting. So while India still is committed to national development, India also views space as a very critical component of its identity, civilizational capability, as well as its ability to build national security. And then the final interesting contribution by India is that it wants to now commercialize its entire space industry. And Michel Henlon talked about a very critical concept, which I think, again, sometimes people don't get into the discourse enough, which is that space tourism is actually not a bad thing. It's going to contribute to the economy and give you those resources to build more and more access to space. What is interesting is that India's Science and Technology Minister, for the first time, and from a departure from earlier discourse, said that India's entire human spaceflight program is about building the tourism sector. It's about building space tourism because that is what will give us access to space that we talk about and democratize space. So this is why I think India will play a much more critical role in the years to come. India has taken the decision, as you say, institutionally to build a new Space India Limited, which completely focuses on public-private partnerships. And in fact, the entire system has been put in place to make the regulatory licensing much more easier as well, with a single-stop in-space institution. And so this is the structure today. If I had shown you this map 5 years ago, you would not have found anything with industry, anything with New Space India Limited in that map. Today, it is a completely changed space environment for India. So even science projects are going to be commercialized, and so it's a very interesting model that India is actually showcasing to the world, and which something we need to keep in mind when we think about access as well. Space is also a very critical component of India's diplomatic move. India has built a South Asia satellite that offers free data to countries in South Asia. India is also part of the Japan-led the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. India is uncomfortable with the Belt and Road Initiative, which China has instituted, especially the Spatial Information Corridor, because there are certain areas in the BRI that is disputed between India and Pakistan, and that is included in that particular corridor. The Chinese perspective is that this is, of course, core Chinese territory, but the Indian perspective is that this is something that a third country should not be commenting on. India is very much focused on developing space launch capability across the world. The future that I see coming is going to work this way. So we have nations in Africa. African Union has just joined the G20 as a permanent member under India's presidency. So what I see happening is that in the next 5-10 years, space will become a very critical component of capacity building and will be included in forums like the G20 as well, as a very high level of collaboration between emerging nations. Nigeria, for example, is a very key player. And so India will play a role in building up those capabilities as well as collaborations. And US-India space collaboration will, of course, play a very critical role in the development of India's space capability. And so finally, I'll end with this basic slide. So I mentioned that the discourse on space is changing fast. So what does India bring to the table, given the fact that it has an advanced space capability? You saw it land on very close to the lunar South Pole in August. Sending out data to the world through a very transparent modem. So I think India will start contributing about 9% to the global economy, which is space, by 2030. That's the goal, which means that by 2040, the idea is to contribute about $40 billion to $1 trillion space economy, which is the hope for India. Now, the other thing which I think where India will play a role is in constitution of space norms and space treaties. We talked about that as well. I disagree with a statement like space is the Wild West. It's really not. You have treaties that limit state behavior. Most states are signatory to the Outer Space Treaty. But I think the Indian position in terms of building, for example, a moratorium which the US championed for anti-satellite testing, is very critical to realize. So the Indian position was that while we speak about norms, it's really important to get to a treaty. And this is something that comes from the history of colonialism and the history of fear that Global South, whose voice is really critical at the level of the United Nations, argues, which is that you might have space norms, which are guidelines, which are principles, but they are not treaty. And so if a powerful nation decides to break a norm, who is going to ensure that they will be they have some level of repercussion? The only way states can be limited in behaving in a way that is detrimental is through space treaties. And so you might have an anti-satellite moratorium norm. What happens if a country decides to suddenly not agree to that norm anymore? There is no treaty obligation. And so that is the Global South's position, given the historicity of their trauma with colonialism as well as what happened at the time. And so I think we need to keep that in mind when we think about consensus building at the level of the UN and understand different nations' position in terms of building consensus. And I think India's support for a direct assent anti-satellite weapon moratorium is extremely critical, and I see it happening. Then there are differences in terms of language, and I'm sure Michelle will have a lot to say on this. So when I read the Indian position on why they were abstaining from supporting even an open-ended working group that talked about limiting military activities in space, the argument was that responsible is a word that can leave all of us to a lot of interpretation as well as behavior. How do you decide who is responsible, who is not? How do you limit behavior? So what we actually need to focus on is capacity. Now, whether there is the right way to go, it's a difficult question, but that's the Indian position. So we need to restrain space capacity so that it does not lead to irresponsible behavior. So it's a very interesting position in terms of India in this regard. National security space will always play a very critical role in India's imagination of space and space policy, and it's actually starting to make a much greater presence in India's space discourse. And finally, there'll always be the connection to emerging space nations. India was historically a champion of the non-aligned movement, as you know. Today, too, India wants to represent the views of the global south, as well as the history that India and other nations suffered during the period of British colonialism. So the idea is that we need to develop space technology, we need to build a mission like Chandrayaan-3, but we do not want to repeat some of the traumas that colonialism brought about because of lack of treaties and lack of international obligation. And I will end there, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.